In the last 8 years, the C-segment SUV space has changed a lot. The PROTON X70 arrived to completely obliterate the Honda CR-V's domination over the segment, and it has remained the #1 best-selling C-segment SUV since then. However, through the CBU 1.8 into the 1.5, I always explain that the X70 is a car that is flawed, but you forgive it because of its price point. However, with this, the MC2 facelift, there are no more excuses, and it still maintains the same attractive price point. My name is Ayman Abdullah, this is Malaysian Motoring, this is our review of the 2025 PROTON X70. While this is a relatively extensive facelift, there are plenty of parts in this car that haven't changed, and that concerns with what's going on under the bonnet. So there is still the same 1.5 litre TGDI direct injection engine producing 177 PS and 255 Newton meters of torque, with power going to the front wheels via a 7-speed dual clutch automatic gearbox. Now, Proton claims that fuel economy in this car has been improved by some 4% as a result of a revised final drive ratio, improving this car's fuel economy when cruising at motorway speeds. However, we will touch on the fuel economy later because I do think that the changes are a little bit more extensive than just what 4% might suggest. Now, the more obvious change with this facelift is obviously the aesthetics, and of course the new walk-away lock function, which is very confused with how I'm standing. But more importantly, everything forward of the A-pillar has been extensively revised. So now the front end sits a little bit further out with a slightly more proud nose, which now comes with the very latest iteration of Proton's corporate identity, with not only the infinite weave and the ethereal bow, but also now the integration of these diamond pins as part of a Songkit-inspired design, which I think looks good, but more importantly, I appreciate how they seem to radiate out from the Proton badge. Either side now sits a set of full LED headlights replete with automatic high beam and LED indicators for the first time. This is obviously an upgrade over the previous X70 where the indicators were bulb type. Now down here we have fog lights, which I will point out are unique to the Proton X70 because no Geely badged version has fog lights. And more importantly, beneath those sit a set of air breathers that actually channel air over the front wheels in order to improve aerodynamics. What I'd also like to point out is the fact that while there appears to be a blanked out plastic space underneath for a radar, the new X70 does not use a radar for its ADAS systems at all. Instead, this car now has an upgraded ADAS system which puts it in line with the X90, X50 and S70, which utilizes a camera that lives up there on the top of the windscreen. Now, if you ask me, the front end facelift of this car has been quite successful because I do think that it does bring the X70 a little bit closer to what you'd expect in 2024, whereas the pre-facelift models did look a little bit dated. I appreciate this front end, and more importantly, for me at least, is this new paint. This deep marine blue is a gorgeous color, especially in the sun, as we sampled in Kundasang in the bright sunlight in Sabah, where we should have a photo of that floating here. And that is most obvious from this angle, where you can see that the front end now sits a lot flusher and a lot further forward than before. But as we move further back, the changes also include a new set of alloy wheel designs. There's still 19-inch rubbers wrapped in Continental Ultra Contact 6 tires, and so this is still a pretty good setup. But this design has been somewhat divisive because while I think they look a little bit more elegant, some people actually prefer the wheel design from the pre-facelift, which was a little bit more busy, but I'll leave that to you. As we move further down the side, there are no changes to report, again, aside from this deep marine blue. Everything is exactly as the way it has always been, including the rather tacky TGDI badge here on the front door. But I will say that as we saw earlier with that proximity lock system, it does at least mean that now as you walk up to the car, the lights greet you and the car automatically unlocks, which means you don't even need to reach for the door handle for it to unlock. That said, however, the lock and unlock sensors are still available on both the two front doors, which means you can unlock this car from either side. Now, while the facelift was rather extensive in the front, at the rear it is limited to just a new bumper panel. This now sits a little bit closer into the tailgate itself, reducing the rear overhang, and there is an interesting mix of materials in order to reduce the visual bulk. So for example, the unpainted plastic portion has been brought further upwards, and it's now garnished with this also gloss black portion down here in order to make this car again look a little bit less bulky from the rear. And the design that has seen the sort of widthways orientation of the reflectors, as well as the inclusion of this little non-functional panel here, is also designed in order to make the car look a little bit wider, a little bit squatter, and therefore a little bit more stable on the motorway. Now, what hasn't changed is in terms of the practicality and the specification for the boot itself, and so this tailgate is still a power-operated unit, although it now also comes with that proximity sensing boot function. So if you stand by the tailgate with a key in your pocket, it will open and close automatically. Of course, I've disabled this function because I reverse into a wall and I don't want to walk behind the car and then have it take my head off. Now, behind the tailgate, you will find again the same amount of space that we've always gotten in the X70, which means that this is not quite as large as what you get from a CRV, but is certainly large enough for 4 adults or even 5. I've seen plenty of people go balik kampung in an X70, loading this completely up to the gills, and as far as I'm concerned, this is a decently practical car. Underneath the boot floor, you will find also a space-saver spare wheel, a Linglong item admittedly. Now, it is worth noting that as part of this facelift, the rear end has lost the Kenwood subwoofer that used to come on the higher end models. Although as far as I'm concerned, that's not really a loss because that Kenwood system was rubbish. Now, as I will talk about a little bit later, sometimes software is a little bit more important than hardware, so don't worry, the loss of the subwoofer means absolutely nothing. What also isn't a loss, as I've discovered, is this new stone grey upholstery for the Premium and Premium X models, because while I did kind of prefer the sort of cocoa brown leather that we used to get, this stone grey nappa does admittedly look a little bit more contemporary, I'd like to think. And because it is still nappa leather, it's still as wonderfully soft as it's ever been, and the seats are still nice and comfortable with a decent amount of lumbar support for the driver, although there is still no angle adjustment for this seat. The passenger seat is also powered, and of course both seats still remain ventilated, although they are only on the seat base and not on the backrest, which is a little bit of a shame. But of course, I know that the majority of you want me to talk about the bigger changes, and so I will. The dash front has been completely redesigned now with a slightly flatter profile, replete with a panel for ambient lighting on the passenger side, which I think looks a bit half-hearted. But more importantly, this dash has been redesigned in order to incorporate this new touchscreen. This is now a wider, more pixel-dense, higher quality screen than we saw from the X70 previously, and it uses the same hardware that we've seen from the X90, X50 and S70. As a result, this screen is now a lot more responsive than it's ever been, and it uses the very latest user interface provided by Acotec. As a result, it means that not only is the face now a lot more customizable with widgets and so on and so forth, which is certainly nice to see, it is also now a lot more connected than before, with even more features available via the Proton Link app. Beyond that, this system now also integrates a few more functions in a more user-friendly manner. So for example, adjusting the seat ventilation is now a much faster process because you can actually tap on it from the main home screen. And of course, the HVAC controls always remain visible no matter where you might be navigating to. On top of that, while this car does also integrate the controls to adjust your fan speed as well as your temperature, they've retained the AC button control panel down here, which means you still have a more tactile way to adjust your temperature and your air conditioning settings. Further below, we also get a redesigned gear lever, again shared with the newer Protons, which means that your park button now sits down here, but it also means that your upwards and downwards shifting action is left to right, which is very strange, and it's not something that I have used at all. The steering wheel is now also shared with the X50 and S70, which means that it's a slightly thicker rim with a flat bottom, and more importantly, the buttons on the driver's side to manipulate the instrument cluster is now a lot more sensible to use, although it's still not the best system in the world. Talking about that instrument cluster, it is still a semi-digital panel with a small TFT screen in the middle, but at least the interface is now in line with what we've seen from newer Protons, which means that you can now also see what the car perceives in the world around it via the camera system that we mentioned earlier. Now, aside from these things, in terms of the overall build and material quality, the X70 2025 with MC2 facelift remains as positive and impressive as it's always been. There are lots of soft touch materials all about the place. In fact, the cowling for the instrument cluster is surprisingly pliant. In fact, this is softer than the center armrest. And of course, the door cards remain all nice and soft with more of that stone grey Napa leather down here with a slightly whimsical design to the stitching. You also still get the oh my god handles in the middle here, like what you get on an old Cayenne. You also get a decently sized center glove box, although it is not that big, but it is impressively deep, replete with a 12-volt socket. You now get a USB-C port on this side, a USB-A port in this side in order to connect your phone to the head unit, which still, at the time of filming on the 30th of September, does not come with Apple CarPlay or Android Auto. Now, they have assured us that this is part of an over-the-air update, but they are still waiting for permission from a certain technology company. I will let you guess which one. Now, in the back of the X70, with the front seats are in my driving position, I'm about 170 centimeters. As you can see, I have a pretty good amount of knee room and a pretty good amount of headroom despite the standard fit panoramic sunroof. And because the front seats sit a little bit high, it does also mean that I have space to tuck my feet in underneath the seat in front of me should I need to stretch out. And this seat base has not been artificially shortened in order to provide the illusion of space, because as you can see, I have very good under-thigh support. These rear seats can also be reclined two-stage should you want to sit further back, but I personally prefer a slightly more upright position. And in terms of the quality in here, everything is just as good as it is in the front. I get a set of nets behind the front seats. I've got decently sized door bins, big enough for a litre-and-a-half size bottle. I've still got a couple of crotch coolers in the middle with a USB-A and USB-C port living underneath them. There is a deployable center armrest here, replete with a automatically revealing cup holder if you bring it down with enough force. And overall, life back here is still as positive as it's ever been. If you're using this as a chauffeur car, because you're weird, you also still have the Boss switches on the front seat, which means sitting in that seat can be a very comfortable affair indeed. Now, as far as I'm concerned, the X70 continues to punch above its weight. Let's not forget that this is still a very attractively priced car, well below 130,000 ringgit, where its only real price competitor is the Chery Tiggo 7. And so, as far as I'm concerned, I think that the appointments in here are pretty good. But the biggest change for this car to me is actually what it's like to drive, because as I've said before, the X70 isn't exactly my favorite C-segment SUV, and it is a car that I've had to excuse multiple times before simply because of its more attractive price point. But that no longer holds true. Now, the thing about Proton is that they like to make lots of small changes throughout the life cycle of a car. Now, earlier this year, we welcomed what they referred to as the Proton X50 RC, or running change, which looks exactly the same as the current X50. It just has a lot of small changes in it, which we've discovered has made it a significantly better car than before. And so, through the gestation of the X70 up to this point, there have been a lot of other running changes. So, for example, the suspension setup was lightly revised for the MC1 in order to compensate for the lighter engine under the bonnet, and those changes have largely been carried through into this car. Now, Proton claims that there have been no other changes to this car's suspension, but it does seem that this car feels a little bit more agile, a little bit more responsive than before, and that, to me, means that there are also, or rather there must be, lots of other changes around about the car. Now, for those of you who watched the preview drive of this car in Sabah, you will know what I'm talking about. As I mentioned before, again, this car feels a little bit more agile, a little bit more dynamic than before. A bunch of small changes have made a rather significant improvement to this car. But the slightly more significant changes, or rather the things that I think that most people will be immediately noticing, is the upgrade in terms of refinement. Now, the X70 was always a decently quiet car. In fact, it's known to embarrass vehicles more expensive than it. But despite that, they've also still managed to find ways to improve it in this MC2. So, for example, road noise has now been even better suppressed, although admittedly the Continental UC6 tyres have never really been known for being noisy anyway. But the wind noise in this car has also been significantly improved. There used to be a very noticeable whistle around the A pillar and the B pillar at speeds above, say, 110. But now it's nice and quiet, it stays muted and refined, which is always a very positive thing. And I think that given the fact that the nature of the X70 is one that is more relaxed, more calm, more comfort-oriented, I think that these refinements in NVH are things that customers will be able to immediately appreciate and of course continue to appreciate over the lifetime of the vehicle. And then of course there are the updates to the powertrain, or rather the lack of updates to the powertrain. As I mentioned earlier, Proton has only admitted to tweaking the final drive ratio on the 7-speed dual-clutch automatic in order to improve high-speed fuel economy. However, the change in this car has been a little bit more obvious to me. So when we drove these cars in Sabah, or rather when I drove this exact car in Sabah, the fuel economy wasn't exactly anything to write home about because, well, we were driving it up and down steep roads, through traffic, trying to maintain a decent convoy, and so speed and responsiveness was naturally of the essence, and so we weren't exactly trying to eke the best fuel economy out of these cars, and more importantly, they weren't exactly representative of how we normally drive. But being able to spend the last week or so in this X70 has allowed me again to sample this vehicle through slightly more realistic real-world conditions, and the improvements are startling. So in the MC1 with the 1.5-litre 3-cylinder engine, we noted that it was nigh on impossible to get this car to do a fuel economy figure anything below 9 litres per 100 kilometres. We normally see at the lowest about 9.5 to 9.8. But in this, through again the last week or so, driving on the motorway, driving through traffic, driving through PJ and its various potholes and varying speeds and many traffic lights, this car has been returning an average of about 8.6 litres per 100 kilometres, which is a significantly better improvement over any X70 that we've seen before. In fact, in terms of fuel economy, I would say that actually puts it more in line with the mild hybrid X90, again, without having to have a hybrid system. And so to me, it feels that Proton has made the necessary changes in order to make this car far more livable day to day. Again, I'd like to point out the fact that this car was driven through traffic with the adaptive cruise control on, through traffic jams, through stop-start traffic, the worst possible conditions for an engine or a powertrain like this, but the X70, or this X70 rather, didn't stutter at all. That to me is very impressive. They've taken a relatively thirsty engine and turned it into something that is livable. Which is why it goes back to what I said at the very beginning of this video, that you don't have to make excuses for this car anymore. The advantageous price point isn't the only reason to consider an X70. Now, you can look at this with the same objective eyes as you would any other car and realize that it's just a well-engineered C-segment SUV. And the same thing goes to the semi-autonomy systems in this car, because previously the X70, while it did offer adaptive cruise control, etc., it wasn't able to do traffic jam assist. Something about the radar system and the way it was implemented initially meant that it would only do adaptive cruise control down to a minimum speed of 30 kilometers an hour, but now no more. This is now able to do full speed adaptive cruise control all the way down to 0, which means that driving through traffic is a even less painful affair than it was before. On top of that, because this car's radar-guided cruise control does like to keep a slightly bigger distance, as we've seen from other Chinese brand implementations, it also means that the way this car responds is a little bit more relaxed in stop-and-go traffic, although I will admit that it does seem to react a bit suddenly to new vehicles cutting into queue. It does tend to brake a little bit suddenly, which tends to freak me out because I'm worried about the car behind me rear-ending me. But aside from that, it is largely all right. And using the intelligent cruise control in this car, which steers to keep you in lane, I will note that driving on the North-South Highway, for example, means that you use, or there are very little inputs required from the driver in order to keep the car on the straight and narrow and chugging along, which is nice. So what that essentially means is that with this facelift, the X70 feels like it's finally come of age. When the X70 first arrived with the 1.8-litre 4-cylinder, it felt like a bit of a rush job. Like Proton had to keep up with the requirements as part of the joint venture agreement with Geely and also with the government for the soft loan that preceded it, that it needed to get a new model out very quickly, and so the X70 was shoehorned to fit in the lineup as quickly as humanly possible. And then we saw with the MC1, it felt like the Proton engineers were given a little bit more leeway in order to make this car feel like more of an indigenous product. And now with this MC2, it's gotten even better still. It's very clear to me that Proton's engineers have had a lot to do with this car, from the way it drives to the polish within the execution of the user interface, for example, and the various different features within this car. It just feels like Proton's engineers have had greater ability to turn this into something that Malaysians really want. That is certainly a point of advantage for the X70 compared to newer, flashier vehicles like the J-Crew J7 and the Chery Tiggo 7 Pro. Because while those two cars certainly put a very good value proposition forward, there are certain very Chinese idiosyncrasies that tend to cheapen the experience somewhat, but you certainly don't experience that in here. Sure, I would have preferred if the adaptive cruise control was a little bit better polished, and yes, I would have loved for this car to drive with the sort of dynamic agility that we've come to expect from Proton, but we have to temper our expectations. This is a C-segment family SUV, something that is largely being used by buyers sort of above the 30-year-old threshold, looking for something that is comfortable and reliable and dependable, which is exactly what this car is. The X70 to me now feels like the product that it should have been upon arrival. Yes, it shook up the C-segment SUV space very significantly when it arrived, but again, it required excuses explained away by its attractive price point. Now, this is just a really solid product. And what excites me more than that is the fact that the X70 remains a very strong product for Proton in export markets. And so after having seen the MC1 go out abroad all the way to South Africa, as well as other countries like Pakistan, for example, it excites me as a Malaysian to see this product, which feels more like a Proton, arrive in those export markets and carry the Malaysian flag with pride. I really do like this car, which is why you can probably tell I'm waxing lyrical about it, because yes, it's a Proton, and yes, this is relatively affordable or attainable for a lot of people, but there's something about this that really just, I like it. I like it a lot. I'd love to spend a bit more time in this, but unfortunately, because we are ultimately the very first people to have this car out for review, they are now rushing us to bring it back. Now, of course, the X70 isn't perfect, because for those of you who may be shopping within this segment who do a lot of motorway miles, for example, you may prefer the security offered by the all-wheel drive system in the J-Crew J7, although admittedly that is a 146,000 ringgit vehicle, whereas this is about 125. And of course, if you need more space, be it for people or luggage, then perhaps vehicles like the Honda CR-V might be a little bit more appealing to you, because of course that car has the various magical functions of fantastic product engineers, which is why Honda remains offering some of the most practical vehicles within any segment they compete in. But to me, the Proton X70 is an excellently well-rounded package. I think that this is a car that's very easy to live with. It's a car that I would be quite happy to live with. It's a car that I would quite happily recommend to a lot more people now that I feel that it is, like I said, a more complete package. And that concludes our review of the Proton X70 Premium X, the one with the sunroof. If you enjoyed this video, please give it a thumbs up, subscribe to the channel, hit the little bell icon to be notified every time we make a new upload. Don't forget to follow us on Facebook, Twitter and Instagram. All the links are in the description below, including the link to join our new WhatsApp channel, so you will never miss an update from us. Thank you so much for watching. We'll catch you in the next one. Take care, stay safe, and jangan bodoh.